We've all met someone whose ego filled every room before we even walked in. They needed to be right, needed to win, needed to feel powerful, even if it meant making you feel small. And for a while, maybe you stayed. You tried to explain, to compromise, to love them harder, hoping they'd finally see you, hear you, choose you. But they didn't. Not because you weren't enough, but because they were too busy listening to the sound of their own importance. Until one day, you stopped talking. You stopped showing up. You left. And that silence, that absence, it was louder than every word you ever said. Because sometimes the most powerful message you can send is simply not being there anymore. His ego needed attention constantly. It craved the spotlight in every conversation, every disagreement, every moment that was meant to be shared. He had to be the one who was right, the one who knew best, the one who had the final word. And you were expected to accommodate that, to make room for him, to shrink just enough so he could expand. At first, maybe it didn't feel like a big deal. You told yourself it was just part of his personality, confident, assertive, passionate. But over time, you started to notice the difference between passion and pride, between confidence and control. You began to realize that when someone is always talking, there's no space for you to be heard. That when someone's ego is loud, it doesn't mean they're strong. It means they need to be seen, constantly reassured of their worth, usually because they haven't figured out how to give that to themselves. His ego filled every room like noise pollution. It spoke over your thoughts, your needs, your instincts. And it wasn't just about who said what in a disagreement. It was the subtle erosion of your voice, the way your opinions started feeling like interruptions, the way your boundaries became optional suggestions rather than respected lines. But here's the thing, love doesn't compete for space. Love doesn't silence. Love doesn't ask you to become invisible just so someone else can feel important. When someone truly loves you, they want to hear you. They lean in when you speak. They notice when you go quiet. Not because their ego needs a reaction, but because their heart is attuned to your presence. Real love isn't loud in the way ego is. It's not about winning, it's about witnessing. It's about mutual safety where both people get to be seen and heard. You may have spent so much energy trying to explain what you needed, trying to make him understand that validation doesn't mean giving in, that partnership isn't a hierarchy. But that's the trap. When you're with someone whose ego runs the relationship, it convinces you that if you just say it right or show enough patience, they'll finally listen. But ego doesn't listen, it reacts. It protects itself, even at the cost of intimacy, especially at the cost of intimacy. So when you finally stopped trying, when you stopped engaging in the same circular conversations, when you let the silence speak instead of your tired explanations, something powerful happened. You reclaimed your voice not by shouting, but by stepping away. You stopped fighting to be heard by someone who never made space to listen. And what he didn't realize in all his volume is that your quiet exit would carry a deeper echo than any argument ever could. Ego is loud because it fears irrelevance, but your absence, that's what commands real attention. Not because it's manipulative, not because you wanted to prove a point, but because it was the most honest reflection of your worth. You didn't leave to make noise, you left to find peace. And in doing so, you showed that the most valuable thing in the room wasn't who could talk the most, it was who made space for truth, connection, and respect. That was never something his ego could offer. And now, in your absence, he might finally feel the difference between being impressive and being loved. One demands the spotlight, the other shares it. When you walked away, you didn't slam the door. You didn't make a scene. There were no fireworks, no dramatic exit, no grand declarations. You just left. And in that quiet departure, you did something more powerful than all the words you ever said. You sent a message that was unmistakable, undeniable, and unforgettable. This is what it looks like when someone finally chooses themselves. You spent so much time trying to explain how you felt. You tried to communicate calmly, to bridge the gap, to make things work. You explained what hurt, what you needed, where things were falling apart, but it never seemed to matter. He listened, but only halfway. He heard your words, but not your heart. He responded not with empathy but with defensiveness, or worse, indifference, and after a while, you started to wonder if your voice even mattered, if your needs would ever be enough, if your love was being wasted on someone who saw your pain as an inconvenience rather than a call to action. There's a kind of exhaustion that comes from explaining yourself to someone who's not listening to understand, but listening to respond. You start repeating yourself, not because you love the sound of your own voice, but because you're hoping, praying that maybe this time it'll finally land, that maybe he'll finally see you, but he never did, because his ego was too busy talking over the truth. So eventually, you stopped explaining. You stopped repeating, you stopped showing up for conversations where your feelings were minimized or flipped back on you. You stopped trying to decode the mixed signals and dismissive tone, and instead of giving one more chance, you gave yourself the gift of distance. You left without fanfare, without the need to be understood one last time, because you finally understood something bigger. He didn't have to get it for you to walk away. And that's what makes your absence so loud. You see, ego expects conflict. It expects a fight. It thrives on drama because that gives it fuel, something to push against, something to feel superior to. But when you remove yourself from the equation entirely, when you stop reacting and simply disappear, ego doesn't know what to do with that. Suddenly, there's no one there to validate it, no one to prove wrong, no one to perform for. It's just left with silence. And in that silence, the weight of your absence becomes deafening. He may not have taken your words seriously, but now he has to sit with your silence. And that silence says everything. It says, I tried. It says, I hoped. It says, you had your chance. It says, I'm done explaining why I deserve more. You didn't need to break things to make a statement. You didn't need to raise your voice or burn bridges. The power was never in how loud you could be. It was in how clearly you could walk away. That kind of absence lingers. It makes him realize that you were never begging for attention, you were offering love. And what he mistook for weakness was actually strength in its quietest form. Now, every time he doesn't hear from you, every time he looks at his phone and sees nothing, every time he replays the last conversation and realizes how calm you were, it hits, not like thunder, not like a scream, but like the slow, inescapable realization that something real is gone. That your silence wasn't avoidance, it was closure. That your absence isn't passive, it's powerful, and that you never needed to win an argument to prove a point. Your leaving was the point. He always walked into the room like he owned it, head high, chest out, words sharp. He spoke with the kind of confidence that made people stop and listen. But over time, you started to see that what looked like strength was something else entirely. It wasn't grounded, calm, or safe. It was reactive, loud, and often overcompensating. He had to be the center of attention. If someone challenged him, he got louder. If someone questioned him, he got defensive. And if you tried to set a boundary, you became the enemy. At first, you might have confused it for passion or leadership. There's something intoxicating about someone who seems so sure of themselves, until that certainty becomes weaponized. It wasn't long before you realized that every disagreement turned into a power struggle. Every time you brought up a concern, it somehow got flipped back onto you. You weren't being understanding, you were too sensitive. You weren't supportive, you were attacking him. He had a way of turning your emotions into inconveniences and your vulnerability into something to be dismissed. But here's what took time to see. The loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest. In fact, the ones who shout the most, who dominate conversations, who can't bear to be questioned, those are often the most insecure. True strength isn't noisy. It doesn't need to prove itself. It doesn't crumble in the face of a different opinion, and it certainly doesn't silence others to feel powerful. Real strength sits in stillness. It listens. It acknowledges discomfort without needing to destroy it. It doesn't have to control the narrative because it's secure enough to hold space for more than one truth. The strongest people don't need to win every argument. They care more about understanding, resolution, and connection. They don't walk into a room needing to be seen as the smartest, the most dominant, or the one who's always right. They walk in grounded, and that energy is unmistakable. What you experienced wasn't power, it was fear disguised as confidence. It was ego masked as leadership, and the cost of staying around that kind of noise, it's heavy. It chips away at your self-worth. It makes you second-guess yourself. It turns love into a performance where you're constantly trying to manage someone else's emotions while neglecting your own. Because when one person's ego takes up all the oxygen, there's no room for both people to breathe. Eventually, you stop trying to out-talk him. You realize that strength wasn't in matching his volume, but in reclaiming your peace. You no longer needed to prove your point. You didn't need to fight for space in your own relationship. You began to see that his constant need to be on top was actually a sign of imbalance, not confidence. And you learned that the relationship you were building was more about avoiding his triggers than building mutual respect. Walking away from someone like that isn't easy. It can feel like losing someone powerful, someone bold, someone who filled your world with intensity. But what you gained in return was quiet, stability, clarity. And with that, you began to feel your own strength, one that doesn't have to be loud to be real. He might still be the loudest person in the room, but you've come to understand something deeper, that real love and real strength doesn't shout over you. It sits beside you. It hears you. It respects your voice without needing to silence it to feel whole. And that kind of strength, it lasts longer than any ego ever will. When you were in it, you couldn't always see it clearly. That's the thing about being close to someone. You get caught up in the details, the habits, the routines. You excuse things because you want to believe the best. You tell yourself, he's just stressed, just misunderstood, just trying in his own way. And you keep giving chances, adjusting, rationalizing because you've invested so much. You remember the good moments, the promises, the potential. So you stay even when it feels off, even when your intuition nudges you in quiet moments to pay attention. You stay because you love, and love, for someone like you, is never half-hearted. But time has a way of revealing what proximity conceals. And it wasn't until you stepped back, emotionally, physically, maybe both, that the truth became clear. The dynamic you were in wasn't love, not the kind that nurtures and uplifts. It was more about walking on eggshells, about managing his moods, about holding everything together so it didn't fall apart. And the more distance you gained, the more you realized how much of yourself you had been silencing just to keep the peace. You started to see the patterns, how disagreements always turned into character assassinations, how your needs were minimized while his were treated like emergencies, how the relationship operated on his terms, his timelines, his comfort. From a distance, what felt complicated now looked manipulative. What felt like passion now looked like control. What you called miscommunication was actually a consistent lack of respect. And maybe the most painful part was realizing how hard you tried, how many times you bent without breaking, how much you carried emotionally just to keep the connection alive. You weren't just showing up, you were overextending, giving more than was healthy, hoping he would meet you halfway when he was never even moving. That realization stings, but it also frees you. Because when you get space from a toxic dynamic, your clarity returns. You remember what it feels like to breathe, to speak without fear of being misunderstood, on purpose, to express a feeling without it being twisted into weakness. And you start to rebuild a relationship with yourself. The version of you that trusted your instincts, that knew her worth, that didn't need to be constantly validated to feel secure. Absence has a way of amplifying truth. The things that didn't sit right start screaming when you're no longer inside the noise. And you finally begin to ask the real questions. Why did I feel the need to over-explain myself? Why was I so afraid to set boundaries? Why did I accept being loved only on someone else's terms? These aren't questions you could have answered while you were still trying to survive inside the relationship. But with distance, you're no longer surviving, you're observing. And that's when healing begins. The clarity you have now is the kind that only comes after stepping away. Not just physically, but emotionally, energetically. You no longer need to convince yourself that it wasn't that bad, or maybe he'll change. You see it for what it was. And even more powerfully, you see yourself more clearly too. You see how strong you were, how patient, how loyal. But you also see where that loyalty turned into self-abandonment. It took stepping away to finally recognize that love isn't meant to feel like confusion. It's not meant to keep you guessing. It's not meant to make you feel small so someone else can feel big. And now, in your absence, the things you couldn't see before are unmistakable. Not because they suddenly changed, but because you did. Because distance didn't just create space between you and him, it created space for truth to finally speak. There comes a point when you no longer feel the need to explain why you're pulling back, why you're no longer available, or why your energy has shifted. At first you might want to. You want them to understand. You want them to see the moments you bit your tongue, the nights you went to sleep feeling unheard, the effort you put in hoping something would change. You want to believe that if you just lay it all out one more time, calmly, clearly, without anger, they'll get it. They'll see what you see. But they don't. And not because you didn't say it well enough, not because you weren't patient enough, but because some people are only capable of hearing what doesn't challenge their comfort. Eventually you learn that you don't owe anyone a perfectly worded explanation for choosing yourself, especially not someone who constantly overlooked you when you tried to explain things the first 100 times. You realize that your peace, your mental health, and your self-worth don't need to be defended like a case in court. You don't have to argue for your own needs to be respected. You don't have to explain why it hurts when you were dismissed, or why you're no longer willing to tolerate being treated like an afterthought. And this isn't about being cold or distant, it's about clarity. When you know your worth, your decisions become quieter. You stop performing pain just to be believed. You stop hoping someone will finally say, "I get it now." Because the truth is, if they wanted to understand, they would have already leaned in. When someone truly values you, they don't need a detailed exit speech to treat you better. They notice your silences. They feel the shift. They recognize that love isn't something to be maintained through pressure or explanation. It's something to be nurtured through presence and action. Self-respect changes everything. It doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply walks away. It withdraws its energy. It lets go without a final monologue. And in that silence, a very clear message is sent. I said everything I needed to say. I've tried. I've shown up. And now, I'm choosing to stop explaining myself to someone who was never really listening. There is power in that kind of quiet. Not the passive kind, but the kind that comes from being deeply aligned with your own truth. You stop wasting energy trying to be understood by someone who benefited from not understanding you. You stop making excuses for their lack of effort. You stop justifying why you're tired, because you know the answer. You lived it. And ironically, that's when they often start to notice, not when you begged, not when you reasoned, but when you got quiet. When you no longer chased the conversation, when you no longer felt compelled to explain your feelings like a thesis paper. That's when they start to feel your absence in places they didn't expect. Because when someone has been centered in your world for so long, they start to believe your care is permanent. But care is not unconditional when respect is missing. Love is not an obligation, and your presence is not a given. The most powerful boundaries aren't the ones you scream. They're the ones you enforce in silence. When you stop showing up where you're not seen. When you no longer argue for the bare minimum. When you let your distance say what your words no longer need to. That's not weakness. That's self-respect. That's strength. And the ones who truly get it, they never needed a long explanation in the first place. There's a difference between being missed and being learned from. You weren't just someone who passed through his life. You were someone who showed up fully. You brought care, presence, patience, and effort. You gave chances, you held space, you believed in his potential even when his behavior didn't reflect it. But he mistook your consistency for permanence. He thought your kindness was infinite, your love unconditional, your forgiveness guaranteed. And when you finally walked away, he may have felt the absence, but what he was really left with was the lesson. You weren't the one who lost when you left. You were the one who finally realized that staying would cost too much. It would mean continually shrinking yourself to keep the peace, pretending things didn't bother you just to avoid another defensive outburst, carrying emotional weight that he never even tried to lift. You were trying to grow together, but he was too busy guarding his ego to grow at all. And love without growth eventually becomes a prison, one where you're constantly managing someone else's fears at the expense of your own truth. Now, in your absence, he may feel something he didn't expect. Quiet accountability. Because when the drama fades, when the arguments stop, when the noise settles, he's left alone with himself. And for someone whose ego was always louder than his humility, that kind of silence can be uncomfortable. He might try to paint you as the one who gave up too soon, the one who changed, the one who walked away. But deep down, he knows. He knows you were the one who stayed longer than you should have, the one who gave more chances than were deserved, the one who tried to hold it all together when he didn't even notice it was falling apart. You weren't just a relationship, you were a mirror. You reflected everything he wasn't ready to face. You showed him what real connection looks like, vulnerable, honest, requiring effort. And instead of rising to meet it, he resisted it. He protected his pride, his habits, his need to feel right. But here's the thing. Lessons don't come wrapped in comfort, they come wrapped in regret. And that's what your absence has now become for him. A slow, unavoidable lesson in what it means to take someone for granted. He didn't just lose a partner, he lost a version of life that had depth, kindness, and emotional safety. He lost someone who would stood beside him as he grew, if only he had been willing to grow. And that realization, when it finally hits, won't be loud, it won't be some dramatic moment. It'll come in the quiet, maybe when he's alone on a Sunday afternoon, or when he sees someone who reminds him of how gently you spoke, how deeply you cared. It'll come when he realizes that all his control couldn't stop you from outgrowing the version of love he was offering. You weren't the mistake. You were the lesson. You were the turning point he'll think about when he's finally ready to show up differently for someone else. Maybe he'll tell her about you, not by name, but in the way he listens more closely, the way he apologizes without being asked, the way he shows up without making it feel like a favor. That's the kind of mark you left. Not a wound, but a wake-up call. And whether or not he ever says it out loud, he'll know. You weren't the one who wasn't enough. You were the standard he didn't meet, the absence he didn't expect to feel so sharply. And the chapter that, if he's honest with himself, he'll quietly wish he'd written differently. We spend so much time trying to be heard in relationships that we sometimes forget the value of walking away when we're not. His ego may have been loud, demanding space, control, validation, but your absence? That spoke the truth he refused to hear. Because leaving wasn't weakness, it was strength. It was the moment you chose peace over chaos, self-worth over explanation, growth over comfort. You didn't need to shout to be powerful. You didn't need to beg to be valuable. And you didn't need to prove your love one more time to someone who couldn't match it. Your silence, your distance, your decision to step back, that was your loudest and clearest message. He may never admit what your absence taught him. He may never say your name when he talks about the one who changed everything. But deep down, he'll know. You weren't just someone he dated. You were the turning point, the boundary, the lesson, the loss that taught him what love really looks like when it's gone. And you didn't just leave. You leveled up.